Do you still watch the league from a fan perspective, or do you always put your coach goggles on?
Uh, it's I was just talking about this yesterday on stream actually, or was it day before yesterday? And it was like basically um I find co-streaming sometimes very awkward because I'm like between the two worlds, because it's hard to analyze when stuff's going at normal speed. I can give them a general breakdown and give them some analysis, but sometimes I just want to watch and just go, "Wow, that fun," and not really engage myself too hard. It can be hard. It's definitely can't ignore some things, but for the most part, no, I can still turn on the TV and just sit down and be like, oh, that was a fun game, and not overthink the details too much.
Do you enjoy the current meta? How it shook out so far in the first week?
Yeah, I think it's been very engaging. I think I will give Blizzard a lot of credit for it because I do think they get at least a good chunk of the credit for the game isn't perfectly balanced right now. It is impossible to perfectly balance a game. I think we all should be aware of that. But what they have done is they've made frequent changes more so than they have ever before. Now, whether Moira should be getting buffed and Ana getting nerfed is a question for another story. But I do, more than anything else, having some form of dynamics with the changes that we're doing and doing them rapidly is something that the league has needed for 5 years or however long it's been. So because now it's like, is Moira better than Kiriko in a short range map? That was a question I was trying to answer yesterday. I don't know. I don't think any of the teams even know necessarily. So I think the fact that that's an answer of I don't know is actually really refreshing. And I also want to give credit to some of the teams, even some of the teams that are struggling and really the bottom of the ladder right now, for finally recognizing that you're not going to beat the Los Angeles Gladiators in a dive mirror. It's not going to happen. Or, fill in the blank. You're not going to beat, I'm trying to think here. Who was it? Boston Uprising necessarily in a dive mirror. Like these teams that are they're not the best, but you can't compete with the players that they have at those positions necessarily. So you need to find your own flavor, even if it's just simply running a diva instead of a Winston. That's, I think, a bit of flavor that these teams are actually getting bold enough to try, which, I won't name any names, but last season there were a few Metaslave teams that I just was like, honestly baffled. You don't have to run Ryan May stage one if you want to, but don't try and run meta when you're just gearing. I'm looking at these teams like you're going to go in six. I just know you're going to go in six, and I'm glad that culture is potentially breaking up at least a little bit. But also credit to the developers for changing rapidly as well.
I think in many ways it feels like the meta that people follow seems, yes, it's definitely determined by a game balance, but it's also really determined by the social factors that are at play. So someone comes in, maybe they are, maybe you're close to them and you're scrimming them a lot more. I think like London was scrimming gladiators a lot, right? And maybe that's like in that micro scrim bubble something can develop there. But if I'm a lower tier team, yes, I know that I'm probably not going to out execute anyone above me in the public meta comp, but I'm also not going to get quality scrims if I try to do my own stuff, right? So it feels like you're constantly playing the game of trying to appease whatever,
Right,
social component you
right.
have there, but you also try to, find your own niche. And there's not great tools because we don't have drills and like,
No, we
playing
don't.
against AI or whatever, right? That you
No.
could be doing. So how do you solve that?
I think the way to solve it is, I mean, obviously London dealt with that a little bit early on in the season, especially because we were not very good early in scrims. We were not barely beating anybody. But I think you either have to just bite down and just, we're going to make this, if we have confidence that this composition has potential, we are just going to have to take the fact that some teams are going to, gray list us or blacklist us and just find trust in the process of the practice that we're getting. But I also think that the 2 points that I brought in before go hand in hand. The fact that Blizzard is making these changes more frequently means that nobody really knows for sure if what fill in the blank lower tier team here is that bad practice. Well, actually, we're not really sure because that might actually be good. Maybe Diva is good. Maybe Queen is actually playable. Maybe Moira is playable. Is Sombra really OP? Do you have to one trick Sombra? Are you sure? Is Hitscan bad? Is Hanzo good? Right. So I think if as long as we can keep this going, we don't need to answer that question because nobody's going to really know the answer for sure. Now, if things do settle down, then yeah, you're going to have to start weighing how far off meta do we want to go to the point where teams aren't going to be willing to scrim us. I don't think teams are going to care that much if you play Brig instead of Lucio. But I do think teams are going to care if you start playing, like let's say Torbjorn and Brig, and then it's a grading scale. All these teams play Tor, Brig, and Queen. I don't want to scrim that team. Oh, they only play Brig. Okay, so it's a very nuanced kind of a take there.
For sure. Like one interesting aspect was, I think in past seasons it was often Dallas that would push the meta. Right now it feels like okay, some stuff feels very balance dependent because the dominating teams don't necessarily have anyone that's far away or far ahead of everyone else. I'm thinking specifically Winston. Winston just feels pretty good.
Yep.
Sombra, I'm less inclined to say, like, maybe she's really good, but also the best team in NA right now has by far the best Sombra player. So that also socially reinforces that once again. And their Tracer player is also great. So, like, and then I saw you trying to argue for Junker Queen Moira, right? Is there something like a social component that if we find the savant of Junker Queen and Moira on one team, would that just break it maybe?
Yeah, I think it would. I think what you were saying about Sombra is 100% accurate. I mean, I think, admitting my own ignorance here, I do think that teams were using Sombra too much. A lot of circumstances where I think even a Tracer would have made more sense, considering the rosters that they have. And I think a little bit of confirmation bias maybe here, but I think a lot of times where I was going, why are they playing that? Things didn't go so well. I had the same question sometimes about Reaper as well. So I don't know whether it's the internal scrim meta devolved from whatever else, but Lip probably definitely pushed that along, and that's been the case before. In regards to Junker Queen Moira, that's obviously remains to be unsaid. But I guess, ironically, my concerns about why Junker Queen Moira might not be played is by the very fact that they probably aren't as comfortable on Moira as they are on other supports. So you're going to need Moira to be either somebody just decides, I'm just one-tricking Moira, to really know whether it's better or not, but that's not likely to happen. I think to a lesser extent it goes with Queen as well, not at the top of most tanks. Best tank, essentially. And let's talk about Hanmin. So, I don't know. I think, like you said, it's like individual player skill definitely drives that. I still remember to this day, and I'm going to be honest here, watching Glads try to play Ryan May on some maps, and it was like they didn't really know what they were doing. And they made it work because great mechanical players, but they had no idea what they were doing. But they saw, Backbone execute in these circumstances, but they couldn't quite replicate it that. And I'm sure people were saying that about London with a lot of the compositions that we were playing. So I think it's like you have to be very careful about this is the best comp. Maybe that's just the best player, or maybe that's just the best players, and that's making that hero look really good when we don't have the player that can play to that level. I think that's the tricky part. Because I mean, even watching, what was it? It might have been the first game on Thursday, or it was one of the scrim leagues. Anyway, watching Lit play Sombra, and it's just like there's so many like little things that he's going to do that your Sombra player is not going to be able to do. So you just need to understand that whatever that composition is performing at, you're going to be a full step below that, at least in the Sombra play. And you need to kind of keep that in mind whenever you're trying to decide what is actually meta for us, not necessarily the league.
Do you have a thing that's clear to you what Lip does better than every other Sombra?
I think just a lot of the dynamics of like when and who he's going for hacks. I think one of the things that really stood out to me this past weekend, I suppose, was how a lot of teams were not leveraging hacks on DPS and off angles as much. A lot of teams were very much focused on either tank or backline. And that led to, I think Lip is one of the best at getting hacks off of DPS and just getting these random, Tracer just dies. Well, what? How? Right? Or the enemy Sombra just dies. Well, Lip was hunting their translocator. And everybody knows that those things that you should be leveraging, but Lip seems to always have like that third sense of when is a good time to go for it, when is it not? What's the old economy like? Okay, they're going to go aggressively with an EMP. Their Sombra is probably more aggressively staged, so he's more likely that that translocator is going to be at a destroyable location, and therefore that's more likely to die. And it's a lot of those like little micro decisions that he's making, specifically on I think the periphery, for lack of a better term, that he's just so much better at. And I think that's a lot of times why you see these, what do they call them, the meme peeps or MPs or whatever he does, because he's not sitting in the middle of the enemy team going for these fat EMPs. He's either farming it from range, or he's going for these goofy little off-angle one-hit EMPs that just delete somebody, or these weird creative like psychological acrobatic kind of plays that I don't think a lot of other Sombras go for. I think that's the big thing. I think a lot of teams lost this week because their DPS were getting hacked too much. And whether it was playing versus Lip or not, that is something that Lip definitely excels at.
Okay, well, we're here about explaining things that maybe someone does better than everyone else in the market. I feel like the London Spitfire, I think it's probably the second most impressive performance of a team that's low budget after Boston Uprising in Season 1, probably would have to say. And that is also predicated on a very uneducated scene where the gatekeepers and the general managers didn't have as much of a clue. And the league was smaller, so you probably also had better pickings. We hadn't really figured out how it worked. To do that in Season 5, when the Overwatch 2 stuff might have happened, but with so little resources in comparison, to still make it to the top 5, top 6 in A, is unprecedented in the impact of a sophisticated franchise league. So what do you think London or you guys did that just beat the rest of the field in terms of efficiency?
We did the really boring stuff, I think, pretty darn well. And I think that's the terrible answer that everyone doesn't want to hear. I think if you try to pinpoint any one thing, I think it really is impossible. There wasn't any one thing. Obviously, having Christopher coming in with the experience that he had as leadership, with his player management, with his ability to create and communicate a philosophy, that's obviously was a huge advantage over, I think, a lot of the other teams. I feel like ego trip here. I think we had a good set of assistant coaches. I think X and I filled our niche relatively well, probably better than a lot of other coaches in the league at doing what we do, and then within the organization that Chris set. I think in terms of players, the obvious answer is that yes, to an extent, a lot of the players that we had were underrated at the start of the season. That's obviously in hindsight, not exactly a hot take, but obviously a little underrated. Al-Hadi's the big one, but I think a lot of the other players as well were either underrated initially, or as my favorite phrase I like to say is that players do develop, and players that were not good became better over the course of the season. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget. It's a long season. A lot of stuff can change. I think the team dynamic, and I think Chris gets a lot of credit for this, but also the players' personalities as well, was relatively good compared to what we know of a lot of other teams. I think it's easy to get into your own ecosystem and think and just see the negative problems, see the problems, this player's getting frustrated, or they're not getting as much sleep as they ought to, or they're being difficult, or they're getting depressed. But you have to understand that, like, realistically, every team is dealing with this. And I think compared to what more teams were struggling with, I think we had a very positive team environment. At least we didn't rage quit any scrims. So that was avoided. I think in terms of review structure, I think we had a pretty good review structure. I think we had a pretty good read of what we could get away with meta-wise in terms of Ryan, when we could play Ryan, and then obviously using that confidence, using the macro fundamentals that we had learned to be able to transition beyond Ryan to Junker Queen and to dive and to perform competently in double flex support, as impossible as that feel like that should have been. Being able to make use of the tools that we had. And then I think the last thing is that we just had confidence. I think that is something that comes with player maturity, which I think that we had a little more of than some teams. I don't think that we started that season with a lot of very mature and competent players, but compared to the average team, probably had a slight edge here. And then that's where we get with a little bit of the luck that you've talked about in some of your previous articles, where we were fortunate stage one. to face Vancouver, and I think it was Boston, which was definitely being able to 3-0 Vancouver pretty much set the stage for the rest of the season because that put us in a different tier. And I think the players really built off of that. And then beating Boston, which was a pretty tough game too. Like that was a tough game. Hey guys, we could do this too. And then obviously the Atlanta game, that was just the cherry on top, right? So now that we're thinking like, hey, on a good day, we could even punch up a little bit, right? And I think from that confidence means it's a lot easier to go into practice the next stage and then to do well as we did that stage. I think it was 5-1 or something like that, to do well that stage as well. And honestly, that's where a little bit of lady luck kicks in because, if we have, let's say Ryan's unplayable, do we beat Vancouver? Probably, but it's not going to be a 3-0. It's going to be a lot more competitive. Do we beat Boston? I don't know. Probably not. We might exit that stage 1 and 5 being the same level of skill of team, but go into the next stage with not the same amount of confidence that we have and probably not go 5-1. And I think for most teams and most coaches, that's hard to accept the fact that there is a factor of luck going into it. But I think a lot of players should try to build confidence from that because the results don't always, they really almost never are a completely accurate interpretation of your actual skill. And I see, even this past weekend, I see so many players tweeting out, oh, we're just so bad, so disappointing, I'm so embarrassed. I'm like, oh, well, how well did you perform in scrims? How well were you able to keep focused in the official matches? And if you can go, I did okay in scrims, I worked hard in scrims this week, we prepared really hard, and then in the officials, I think we got a little bit unfortunate, but I think I did a reasonable job, then you really shouldn't be apologizing for anything. You should just be focusing on what you need to do next week. And I think a lot of teams think that if they it doesn't matter what you do in scrims, it doesn't matter what you do in reviews, you need to go in the game, you need to perform. That's just such a naive way of looking at it. You need a little bit of luck, and you need the willingness not just to win, but you need the willingness to prepare. And I think a lot of teams struggle with that and feel like it's like, oh, the results are everything that matters. It's a long season. And you could be and even then, it's like you could be the best team all year long. Think season 1 Overwatch League, and then the meta just shifts, and you're screwed. So I think it's like you got to focus on the process, which is obviously very hard in a tumultuous esports environment, but you have to try and do as much of that. And I think going back to the original question, London had a nice train of confidence driving throughout the course of the season with all the other good factors as well that kind of kept us up. We definitely had our low moments, definitely. I think the start of every new meta in scrims was always a low moment, but we always knew in the back of our mind, we can catch up to these guys. We knew we've done it before, we can do it again. And I think that definitely drove the team forward.
That's part of the reason why I remain bullish on the Uprising, because I feel like a preseason minor disagreement, it's not a problem, especially if you look at the strength of schedule in the first 5 games, where it's like, I think every team they're playing is projected to be in the bottom half of NA.
Mm-hmm.
And then Toronto. Okay, that's then the first competitive team. But even them, they look to be like towards the lower end of the middle tier distribution. Mm-hmm. So it feels like they can now tank up on confidence and then, just by class of their players go far, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think a lot of it is also like the class of player that you have as well, not just in terms of skill, but like maturity as well. A team of rookies starting off poorly in the start of the season. Obviously, there's a few teams that kind of fit that bill this season. That's not encouraging. There might be a renaissance, maybe stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Maybe they come around and clutch out a couple of games. But I mean, I speak from experience there. London was not as bad as the impression was the season before last. But from what I know before I joined on a little past halfway through the season, a couple of close results, a little bit of ping, no team house, and it just snowballs and it gets out of control. And I remember joining the team and trying to fight that tide. And I succeeded with some people, but there were some players on the team that were just totally unreachable. It was over. The season was over the second I joined for at least half the team. And that was really hard to come to terms with personally. But I think as a coach and as a player, like you have to finding players that are able to show the maturity to be able to kind of push past that is really, really hard. Like really hard, especially with gamers that don't have the experience necessarily with dealing with that adversity in a positive light, there's not a lot you can do. And I think a lot of teams have probably struggled with that in the past.
Are there teams where you can sense that both from a mental aspect, but also I want to hear about the strategical aspect, where you're always like kind of intrigued what they have in store for you, both in like player mental, maybe they had a bad week, go 0-2, and you just go, that's actually, that doesn't mean they're down and out. Or do you also think, oh, this is about to produce a curveball? Let's see what they have. Is there anyone?
I just feel like there are not many teams that would be able to do the latter. I don't think that many teams have that mental fortitude to be able to turn it back around again. I mean, obviously, you look at London now, and I should hope that with the leadership that they have and with the more veteran roster that they have, at least compared to last season, that they're going to be able to come back from this past weekend and do relatively well moving forward. But a lot of the other teams, not so much. And I think the damning thing too is that a lot of things like strategy are poorly interpreted with confidence. In other words, you could have a team that has been drilled on the fundamentals really well, but when push comes to shove, the match starts, confidence goes out the window. They look like a bunch of apes. They look horrible. They have no idea what they're doing. And the funny thing is that might not even be a. This is why I'm so careful with like how I interpret. I think Hottie back season before last, right? Worst tank in the league, garbage, But I knew how good he was mechanically. I also knew that he performed relatively well in scrims. But when it was the confidence of the team environment or whatever, and the synergy or the lack of trust with the teammates, I saw how that interpreted in his play, and I see that in other players as well. And I don't go, oh, fill in the blank player is garbage. I think that fill in the blank player is probably not that good, but I think a lack of confidence has a nasty, nasty interpretation. And especially from somebody who spent a lot of time coaching players one-on-one, I know what that looks like in terms of individual play. And it actually surprisingly has a huge impact on mechanics as well. Your ability to hit shots is actually very, very much swayed by confidence. And there is a player in the league actually right now who I know is very much night and day upon whether they're confident or not. They could be near the top tier of really any hero they play, or they struggle immensely if they're not confident. And I think a lot of players probably fall into that category. So it's a tough league out there, man. It is. A lot of players struggle with it, and especially with the maturity that those players have. That's why I think having somebody who's experienced and is able to develop those players' personalities and strength of character is like so important, because you're going to lose games. How you lose those games is going to matter, though.
I have to ask who that player is, right? Is that a no comment or?
Oh gosh, that one is going to be a no comment. That's the only no comment answer I'll say.
No,
That's the
fair
only
enough.
one I'll say.
Fair enough. When I explained that concept to you of a team that feels like they're never totally down and out, I think of Rush teams. Rush, yes. In terms of Dallas.
Yes.
Feel, right? Because over the last 2 seasons, they started very slow. They almost didn't make it to both events, I think. Had a pretty bad record. And then by the time, the season starts there, or rather the real competition starts, they're always like really good, right?
Yeah.
Is that something that you feel? Is there something about the Dallas Fuel that's special, or about Rush?
Yeah, I think so. I think so, and I think that really reflects well on the veterans that they had that had been through the league, and even I think it doesn't have to be the Overwatch league where you develop these skills. Obviously, being able to develop these skills and all the way down to contenders, competition develops these skills if you apply yourself correctly, and especially with somebody like Rush and the leadership that they have, and I think everybody, even scrimmaging them, there were many times where we were beating Dallas in scrims comfortably. Not often, but it definitely happened. But there was never this feeling that, oh, this team is bad. It was always like, they're going to get there. It's the same thing with Shock to an extent as well. It's like, Shock, I would bet a lot of money, is going to be good this season, right? Doesn't matter what the scrim leagues were like. Obviously, they had a pretty good weekend this week, but like, they're going to be a good team. You just know that it's like, with the quality of the player veterans that they have, the quality of leadership that they have, were they going to win the league? Are they going to make top 4? Dallas or Shock? I don't know, but they're going to be good, and they're going to be good. And I think like what you're saying, it's like it also tends to snowball as well. if Dallas was able to showcase their ability to push through when it mattered and perform once, they're going to more likely do it again, because everybody in the back of their minds, even as a coach, right? It helps having confidence as a coach, knowing that we've done this before. If we start off really poorly, it doesn't matter. We're going to be able to turn it back around again. And knowing that you apply yourself differently than you would if you weren't sure. And I think that's something this league is very snowbally as a result of that. I think obviously there's big gaps in between the mechanical capabilities of a lot of these teams, obviously, but I also think that there's big gaps in once things start to go poorly, once things start to go well, that tends to kind of exacerbate the splits, I think.
So if I interpret how you think about the game and the forces that are in place, you must think right now Atlanta is the team to beat for the rest of the season, at least
certainly. I mean, obviously it's 1 weekend in, but depending on how the rest of the stage goes, you're going to have a lot of really confident players, and having that confidence on top of players who are arguably one of the best mechanically teams in the entire league. It's going to be hard to beat a team like that. It's going to be really hard.
Okay, I'm going to ask and that's the last question. And it's a little bit of an unfair one, because it once again requires a miracle. But if you were the Valiant or the Eternal, what would you do right now?
Trying to think. You'd have to find some way to achieve victory. I remember this was one of the things that people were talking about, and I think was it Boston Uprising season 3. Some talking head actually made a good point. I don't remember who it was, but they said something about like they should be scrimming contenders teams more often.
It was Christopher.
And just win scrims, win some scrims. You know what I'm saying? I think like with Valiant and Eternal, you have to find some way to get some sort of positive reinforcement with what you're doing. Not just, oh, we won a scrim, but we learned something from Empress or Coach Paintbrush, and we learned something and we applied it, and we found good results from it, from actually developing a skill. And I think something that I learned from Chris personally last season was also going into the season, and he got criticism from this from even within the team. I know some of the players weren't super happy, but also from the outside perspective, I think it was his interview with you, setting expectations. Hey guys, we're gonna suck. Okay, we're going to be a bad team. Valiant, Eternal are not going to win a stage. It's not gonna happen. It's not going to happen. I don't even think they're going to be able to pull off the miracle run that London did. I don't think they're as good mechanically as we were last season. It's not going to happen. But we can punch up. And we can make this season a development to develop players that maybe either next season we have a better team, or then you can build up your individual value by learning the game more and executing more. Even from a selfish perspective. I mean, I remember when I played, this is kind of a weird analogy, but I played when I was like 13, 14 years old. I was on probably the worst American tackle football team, and probably within 50, 100 miles. We were garbage. But I treated that season as like a personal development season, about like I wanted to practice some skills, and it really paid off. And I think for Eternal Valiant, you could appeal to like, guys, we're going to suck. Let's focus on finding some positive reinforcement, and like let's develop individually as much as we possibly can. Because even if you're like, oh, well, I can't win because that there's some tension between the team. It always happens. Even if they work together for years, you get in the league and you start losing, people are going to start, that have been working together for years, are going to start hitting each other's guts. And again, I speak from experience with that with the London Spitfire year before last. But you could say, you know what, screw it. Focus on yourself and what you need to be doing to get better, and what development that you can make. And that stuff does pay off. I mean, it paid off with London, obviously coming into this past season. And I think if you look at it that way, it's a lot less discouraging when every scrim is a loss or every game is a loss, when you know that I'm personally still developing. And as weird as a roundabout of a way of an approach that is, at least it feels like you can control something. I can control like what I can be doing to get better and what I can be doing to improve. And maybe we'll win a couple of games as a result. But you have to find a way to like not keep the confidence up, because it's such an artificial way to say things, but to be honest that we can't be tied to these results. We know they're going to be bad. We're just not as good. So let's find some sort of process related positive reinforcement through either personal development or find something in scrimmages that besides the results that results in something, because you can't fail that much in scrims and official matches and expect to be able to just tough it out and push through. Human nature really struggles with that much failure. It's hard to not get demotivated even with maturity.
Sweet. Is there anything else that's on your mind in terms of like what you feel needs addressing at this point in the Overwatch League?
I don't know. I'm scared nowadays. I have to be very careful. No, I don't think there's a whole lot more. I will thank you for the work that you're doing. I've been a big fan of your podcast and your interviews, and I think that you're a big contributor to keeping the scene interesting in a positive way, constructive way as well. So shout out to your work, I guess, as awkward as that may be.
All fine. Thanks again. Thank you for the interview, and I'm looking forward to more content coming from you, especially the Overwatch League analysis stuff.
Sure. Thanks for having me.